Hey guys, this is Greg from E13, and today I'm going to talk you through the installation of our Helix 1352 cassette on an XD driver. And first thing I'm going to do is talk you through the tools that we need for this setup. We've got a 3mm hex. It's best to do this with a non-ball end because you'll get better engagement with the screws. We've got a torque wrench with a 3mm hex bit. We're going to be torquing two fasteners on this cassette, 1 to 3 Newton meters and 1 to 1 Newton meter, so a smaller torque wrench is going to be the way to go for that. We've got a cassette lock ring tool. We're going to use that to tighten the two pieces of the cassette together. And for the disassembly, we've got a chain whip here. We won't use that for the installation, but that is how we are going to separate the two parts of the cassette when we get to that point. Over here we've got the cassette that just came out of the box. We've got the aluminum portion here, which is the part that clamps onto the XD driver. We've got the steel portion here. We've got plastic bushing, which is going to support the end of the steel part, and then we've got our lock screw, which is also a 3mm hex. Over here we've got a wheel with an XD driver on it. These cassettes can go on a wheel with an XD or XDR driver. If you install it on an XDR driver, like on some of your gravel wheels, you're going to need to use a spacer, a 2mm spacer behind the cassette. But in this case, we're using XD on a mountain wheel, and so there's no spacer required. So one of the important things to keep in mind when you install your cassette is that appropriate greasing is going to make this thing operate quietly for the life of the cassette and also reduce wear between the two parts. So we've already applied grease to this cassette, but I'm going to show you the places where we actually are going to, where you're going to want to add grease. On the aluminum portion, you can see there are 6 fins that engage with the steel part, and you're going to want to get grease on the back sides of those fins because that's where and on the top because that's where the sliding happens between the steel and the aluminum parts. In addition to those fins, there are 6 pads on the front surface of the cassette where the backside of the steel part is pressing against the aluminum portion, and you're going to want to make sure to get some grease on those pads as well. So that's on the aluminum part of the cassette. On the steel portion, there are 6 fins that are machined into the steel part, and each of those you're going to want to get some grease on the back surface of those because that's what's going to be sliding over the aluminum part. And you don't need to put quite as much as we've got here, but a liberal coating of a nice waterproof grease is going to keep that thing quiet while you're riding the bike. In addition to that, we've got a plastic bushing. This is a Delrin bushing that's Teflon filled that fits into the steel part. This comes from the factory with a light bit of grease on it, and so if this bushing was out of the steel part when it came out of the box, you're going to want to make sure that you push it back into place there. If there's too much grease on that assembly or between those two parts, you're going to find that it may be more difficult to get the steel part installed onto the XD driver later in the process. So if you feel like there's too much grease on there, it's a good idea to take the bushing out, just wipe it off, make sure there's just a very light coating of grease, and put it back into place. And now we're ready to install. Okay, so our next step, we're going to install this cassette on the wheel. Before we do that, we're going to want to put a little grease on the splines of the freehub body. And you don't need to put a ton, but you want to get enough so that there will be grease on every surface that the cassette is touching on the splines. We don't need to put grease on the barrel portion of the freehub body, like out here, because that's where our clamp is going to work. So next up, I'm going to take my aluminum piece and I'm going to slide it onto the freehub body, and when you push it down, you're going to want to rotate it clockwise until the splines engage, and you'll see it drop down into place. There we go. So now it's fully seated against the stop on the freehub. Next, I'm going to take my 3mm hex key and I'm going to apply a little pressure to the aluminum piece and tighten that screw. We're not going to fully tighten it because we'll use the torque wrench for that, but I just want to make sure that's nice and tight. Next up, we're going to pull out our torque wrench and we're going to tighten that screw to 3 Newton meters. You can see I'm still turning. There we go. Now we're good. Next, we're going to take the steel portion of the cassette, and what I like to do is rotate the aluminum piece until the screw hole is facing away from me, more or less. And then you're going to want to look at your cassette and find the notch in the steel part where that locking screw is going to work. There's also a marking on a tooth adjacent to the notch that tells you where to line this up. And then you'll notice on the aluminum part there's a lock and unlock figure laser etched onto the front surface. So we're going to line up that arrow more or less with the unlock. You can have it a little bit to the left of that mark because those fins need a little room to clear before you rotate them into place. So I've just pushed that on, and you can see that it's not fully seated yet on the surface. So the next thing that I like to do is I'll just use the palms of my hand and rock that into place and kind of walk the bushing down onto the XD driver. So now I feel like that's pretty pressed up against the aluminum piece. You can look down between the two pieces and see whether the steel part is now sitting against those pads that we put the grease on earlier, and that's going to tell you if you've got it pushed on far enough. So next, we're going to take our cassette lock ring tool and we're going to lock the steel piece into place on the aluminum part. There it goes. So now you can see that the arrow is pointing at the lock figure on the aluminum piece, and now you know that these two parts are locked into place. So next we're going to use our lock screw on our 3mm hex, and we're going to thread that into the aluminum part. The screw is not actually doing anything other than keeping the steel part from backing out. So we want it to be torqued to spec, but you don't have to go crazy. Making it tighter doesn't tighten the two pieces together at all. So we're going to back this off to 1 Newton meter, which is on this torque wrench is about as low as it goes. There we go. And I'm going to lock that, and you can see that the torque to do that is pretty minimal. So there we go. Now our cassette's all installed, and we're ready to go ride. Okay, next we're going to take this thing apart. It's essentially the reverse of what we just did, except we are going to use that chain whip. So first, I'm going to take out the lock screw, and that came right out. Next, we're going to use a chain whip on the aluminum part of the cassette. So that's kind of the most important thing here, is we're trying to separate the steel from the aluminum part. So we want the chain whip to hold the aluminum piece stationary, and then we're going to use the cassette lock ring tool to remove the steel part. So I'm going to hold the chain whip and turn the steel part counterclockwise so that the fins disengage, and I could feel it come loose there. Just put your fingers through the aluminum part of the cassette, and once again we're going to just rock that steel part back and forth until it pops free. So on some of our cassettes, you may find that your plastic bushing stays on the XD driver. With the 1352, the cassette we're holding here, this bushing has a split in it, so it's a little bit looser fit. But if you do find that the bushing is still on the XD driver, that's fine, because when we take the aluminum piece off, that will come right off at the same time. So next, I'm going to loosen the pinch clamp screw with our hex key, and you want to just make sure that's nice and loose. And the way I usually do this is I put my palm on the hub axle and then just slide the aluminum piece off. And again, if there was a plastic bushing on there, that would pop off before the aluminum piece comes off. But now you're ready to go.